Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the second part of our webinar series titled The Duty to Prevent Genocide in Ukraine, Due Diligence Requirement and Assessing Compliance. I'm Dr. Kausar Ahmed at the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute, Canada, and it is my honor to open today's session on behalf of the Institute as part of the Peace Days Initiative 2025. First, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, whether you are tuning in from Winnipeg, elsewhere in Canada, or another part of the world. Your presence is an important reminder that preventing atrocity crimes is not a remote concern, it is a global responsibility, one that demands careful legal, moral, and political attention. Before I delve into the context and the background of today's episode, let me do the treaty recognition. The institute is based on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homelands of Métis Nation. We all are treaty people, and we are all bound by true spirit of truth and reconciliation. The audience, as you are aware, we are celebrating Peace Days 2025, and it is about promoting understanding, goodwill, and compassion locally and internationally. In our work at the Institute, as part of the mission, we try not only to raise awareness about conflict, human rights, and peace building, but also to examine the legal and institutional frameworks that are meant to prevent some of the gravest crimes humanity faces. And this is our second episode in that humble effort. The war in Ukraine has raised profound questions about state responsibility, international law, and obligations under the Genocide Convention. As many observers have noted, including in recent interventions by state before the International Court of Justice, these obligations do not lie dormant even in complex or ongoing conflicts. States have a duty to assess whether serious risk of genocide exists, then to take measurable preventive steps once possible. Our purpose of today's webinar and the session is built on the last time, which laid out some foundational concepts: what genocide means under international law, what states' obligations are, what due diligence entails. In this second part, we aim to explore what evidence and indicators are relevant when assessing whether a state has met its due diligence requirement to prevent genocide in Ukraine. Secondly, examine concrete legal, diplomatic, and policy actions or inactions that demonstrate compliance or failure thereof with international obligations. And thirdly, discuss obstacles to fulfilling these duties, such as political constraints, evidentiary challenges, competing priorities, and consider what remedies, accountability mechanisms, or reforms may help strengthen prevention. What we hope you will take away, dear audience, by the end of today's webinar is better understand what the due diligence standard requires in practice, particularly in the context of Ukraine, be able to identify key markers of compliance and non compliance by states, international bodies, and others, be equipped with policy tools and frameworks that civil society, legal experts, and decision makers can use to assess and push for better prevention efforts. Of course, before I introduce our esteemed panelist and speaker today, I would like to acknowledge our team, the team at Peace Days, for their ongoing commitment to fostering conversations like these. My colleagues at the Institute, who have done extensive research on forced displacement, genocide prevention, and conflict transformation, and of course, many of the speakers, those who spoke before today and who brought critical expertise, courage, and insight to this topic. The audience, prevention depends not only on legal frameworks or high level diplomacy, but on engagement, on us asking hard questions, on civil society scrutinizing, on communities and scholars contributing evidence, on media reporting, and on states being held accountable. I encourage all of you in this session to contribute your questions, challenge assumptions, and think about how what we discuss translate into action. Let's move forward from awareness toward responsibility and from responsibility toward action. With that, let me have the privilege once again introducing our esteemed speaker, Darcia Sant, today. And as you are already aware, since the first episode was aired on Friday, Darcia is a Canadian lawyer called to the bar in Manitoba and Ontario, with a distinguished career at the Law Society of Manitoba as General Counsel and Director of Policy and Ethics. She has held leadership roles with the Manitoba Bar Association, the Canadian Bar Association, and the Federation of Law Societies, and has taught legal ethics at the University of Manitoba through professional development programs nationwide. In 2025, she completed her LLM degree in public international law at the University of Groningen and is currently a member of Canadian Lawyers for Ukraine, where she continues to pursue her passion for international law. So, with this introduction, I think it is absolutely time to leave her the space. Darcia, once again, welcome and thank you very, very much from the Institute and also from Peace Days, because your insights are very important in advancing knowledge on genocide and genocide prevention. Darcia, the space is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction once again, Kaiser. And just to briefly recap for everyone, especially those who perhaps weren't able to watch the first webinar last Friday, we did talk about at some length what the crime of genocide entails. We looked specifically at Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, and specifically Article 2 sub E, relating to forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. We talked about how the crime of genocide is comprised of both physical and mental elements, and how the crime of genocide has a very specific and special intention requirement, often called dolus specialis, which means that not only does a specific act have to be committed with intention, it has to be committed with the intention to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. We discussed briefly some of the data challenges relating to trying to determine the exact number of Ukrainian children who have been forcibly displaced, although the number on the Government of Ukraine website is around approximately 20,000 children. We know and believe that there are many more. We discussed the categories of transfers and how the categories of transfers can impact or skew the numbers depending on which source you look at. Some of the pretexts for the transfers, just briefly again, we considered the argument that there were security reasons for transferring these children, humanitarian reasons. We looked at foster care and adoptions. And we also looked at what has been billed as temporary stays in so-called recreation camps. However, I concluded that based on my research, official or officially endorsed Russian statements point to a general plan to destroy the Ukrainian national group, and that there is evidence of genocidal intent. I concluded that, in my view, based on my research, there is both sufficient direct evidence of genocidal intent, but even without that direct evidence, there is a pattern of destruction readily discernible, especially when all 5 of the genocidal acts being committed in Ukraine are viewed in their totality, such that genocidal intent to destroy Ukrainians certainly may be inferred. So with that brief recap, I'd like to now discuss this evening's topic, which is the duty to prevent genocide and the due diligence requirement that entails. So separate and apart from the prohibition on the commission of genocide, states have a very distinct duty at international law to prevent genocide in accordance with the provisions of the Genocide Convention. The prevention and punishment of genocide are actually legal obligations that are at the heart of the Genocide Convention. Kaiser, if we could just please have slide number 1. Slide number 1. There we go. Article 1 states, the contracting parties confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law, which they undertake to prevent and to punish. Of course, this is a treaty. So contracting parties talk about the states that have agreed to the treaty and have ratified it. Slide number 2, please. I spoke last Friday about the Bosnian genocide case because it is a leading decision with the merits coming out in 2007. And in that case, the court, the International Court of Justice, clearly stated that the obligation to prevent genocide is not merged in the duty to punish, nor can it be regarded as simply a component of that duty. We could go to slide number 3, please. At the provisional measures stage of the Bosnian genocide case, because that case had various stages throughout, over a period of time, the court took note of those undertakings, as I just referenced in the convention, given by the parties pursuant to Article 1, and they determined that there existed a grave risk of acts of genocide being committed, such that Yugoslavia and Bosnia-Herzegovina were under a clear obligation to do all in their power to prevent the commission of any such acts in the future. In the first provisional measures order, the court ordered Yugoslavia to take all measures within its power to prevent commission of the crime of genocide, including by any organizations and persons which may be subject to its control, direction, and influence. Next slide, please. At the preliminary objections stage of that case, the court held that the rights and obligations enshrined by the Genocide Convention, including the duty to prevent genocide, are obligations that are commonly referred to as erga omnes obligations. And we're going to throw some Latin at you again, as we did last Friday. As noted by one scholar, a key feature of these kinds of obligations is that all states have a legal interest in them and can put forward a claim in the event of violations. Also, obligations to protect the legal interests are so relevant for the whole international community that every state is to a certain extent affected by their violation and is concerned with their implementation. And while I've been speaking about these obligations in reference to the Genocide Convention, and I've noted that that is treaty law, it should be noted that these duties are obligations owed also under what we call customary international law. In other words, the duty to prevent genocide is an obligation that binds not only the states that have actually signed and ratified the convention, but also any states that are not parties to the convention. They still have that obligation because it is already accepted under customary international law, as well as an erga omnes obligation in that context. Next slide, please. Looking at the nature and scope of the obligation, in the Bosnian genocide case, the court provided some specific guidance relating to the application of the duty to prevent genocide. For example, the court determined that the substantive obligation to prevent genocide is not on its face limited by territory. So what do we mean by that? It applies, in the court's words, to a state wherever it may be acting or may be able to act in ways appropriate to meeting the obligations in question. The ICJ also held that the obligation to prevent genocide is an obligation of conduct, not result, in the sense that states can't be under an obligation to succeed when they try to prevent genocide. The obligation, rather, is to employ all means reasonably available to them so as to prevent genocide so far as possible. The court also stated that the duty to prevent genocide places states under positive obligations to do their best to ensure that such actions do not occur. In relation to timing and the question of when is this duty triggered, the court clearly established that a state's obligation to prevent genocide or attempt to prevent genocide and the corresponding duty to act is triggered, and I'm quoting the words of the court, at the instant that the state learns of, or should normally have learned of, the existence of a serious risk that genocide will be committed. Next slide, please. So how do we consider whether a state has properly discharged its obligations and taken all measures? What does that really mean? So the Genocide Convention itself, as you noted, I put the provision up on the first slide, it doesn't clearly stipulate what the duty to prevent genocide actually entails. It doesn't prescribe what states should do in order to comply with that very important legal obligation. So one scholar observed that in that infamous Bosnian genocide case, the court first had to really develop the law before applying it to the facts. And for that purpose, they specifically adopted a due diligence standard, which establishes the standard of care by which the conduct of states is to be judged to determine whether the duty to prevent genocide has been breached or not. As noted, the court clarified that the duty to prevent genocide is a duty of conduct and not result, such that a state does not incur responsibility because the desired result is not achieved. However, the court also held that responsibility is incurred if a state manifestly failed to take all measures to prevent genocide which were within its power and which might have contributed to preventing the genocide. I'm stressing that word. It doesn't say that the actions taken by a state would have had to, by themselves, prevented the genocide. It says which might have contributed to preventing the genocide. In this area, the notion of due diligence calls for an assessment, as the court put it, in concreto, and is of critical importance. When assessing whether a state has discharged its obligations, the court noted that certain factors come into play. The capacity to influence effectively the action of persons likely to commit or already committing genocide. Next slide, please. In looking at the capacity to influence, the court stated that, of course, a state's capacity to influence another state will certainly vary, and it will vary from state to state based on issues such as the geographical distance of the state concerned from the scene of the events in question, the strength of the political and other links between the authorities of that state and the main actors in the events, and the state's legal position vis-a-vis the situations and persons. So, for example, a state that you might call a minor state, and states have equality under the law. So I don't mean to, by making the comment of a minor state in any way, suggest that they are not on equal footing. But if you can consider that a larger state versus a smaller state, that's the context I'm going to be talking about here. A minor state, for example, could probably be considered to have only the obligation to cooperate with other states, most of all diplomatically, in attempting to put pressure on a genocidal actor. However, a greater state power, on the other hand, would have to be much more active, arguably, in order to discharge this important obligation. States should consider that the approach taken by the ICJ in the Bosnian genocide case is actually extremely progressive. And I would submit that legal advisors in the ministries of foreign affairs, of the major powers in particular, should take due note. The more a state can do, the more it must do. Slide 8, please. With respect to actions that states may take in order to try to prevent genocide, these would include things such as the imposition of sanctions, usually targeting specific persons within the perpetrator state, often those operating at the state level. Diplomatic efforts can also be undertaken to reduce tensions between states and hopefully avert escalation of a situation that is already showing earmarks of genocide or the risk of genocide either occurring or continuing. And depending on the location of an emerging situation and having regard to the state's capacity to influence, whether via political links or other links, such as economic ones, some states may provide military, monetary, or humanitarian aid for use by the state at risk of genocide. We should also look at these actions, though, in the reverse scenario, I would submit. In other words, if states that supply weapons to an aggressor state become aware of the risk of genocide being perpetrated. Ceasing the supply of weapons may constitute one action that a state could definitely take in an effort to fulfill its duty to try to prevent genocide. States engaged in significant trade with a state that may be committing genocide may also consider cutting economic ties in an effort to help avert the commission of genocide or the furtherance of genocide that has already started. It's true that a state may be held responsible for breaching the legal obligation to prevent genocide only if genocide is actually committed. However, and I want to stress this, the ICJ stated this obviously does not mean that the obligation to prevent genocide only comes into being when perpetration of genocide commences, since the whole point of the obligation is to prevent or attempt to prevent the occurrence of the act. Again, that's just stressing that this is a very separate duty as opposed to the duty to not commit genocide. Next slide, please. And looking at risk factors and how to make assessments appropriately, I submit that it would be appropriate for states to have policies in place already and mechanisms that are intended to help them identify risk factors for the occurrence of genocide. If you don't have policies in place, how are you to be ready to act if there's a risk that it's already happening? It's incumbent really on states to be aware of such factors and to monitor for the presence of factors that might lead to genocide so that they are then able to act when the duty to prevent is triggered. And remember, on an earlier slide, we talked about when that duty is triggered. For example, the United Nations created a framework of analysis for atrocity crimes, approximately, I think it was 11 years ago, as a tool for prevention. And it identifies 14 risk factors and particular indicators of risk, even within those categories relating to the risk of genocide. For example, factors 9 and 10 and enumerated indicators within those factors specifically relate to genocide. The analysis is for atrocity crimes, but those two, 9 and 10, specifically relate to genocide. Factor 9 deals with past or present conduct that reveals serious prejudice against protected groups. Specifically, indicator 9.2 says the denial of the existence of protected groups or elements of their identity is noted as an indicator of a specific risk of genocide. Factor 10 deals with signs of an intent to destroy in whole or in part a protected group. One of those indicators says official documents, political manifests, media reports, or any other documentation through which a direct intent or incitement to target a protected group is revealed or can be inferred in a way that the implicit message could reasonably lead to acts of destruction against that group. I'm going to focus in particular on indicator 10.4, and it refers to the development of policies or measures that seriously affect the reproductive rights of women or that contemplate the separation or forcible transfer of children belonging to protected groups. And of course, that is exactly what we have been talking about in these sessions. Next slide, please. So how do we assess compliance, specifically in the context of the Russian Federation's war of aggression against Ukraine? To assess compliance or non-compliance with the legal obligation to prevent genocide, it would have to be determined, I submit, what kind of an analysis was even done or undertaken by states of the facts in an emerging situation in order to determine the level of risk associated with that situation relative to the commission of genocide in preparedness for the potential need to respond. With respect to Ukraine, it's important to note that the war did not start in 2022, but rather in 2014, the same year that the Russian Federation annexed Crimea in direct violation of international law. Some have argued that if states had acted with more vigor and more definitively earlier on, perhaps the situation we are in today would not have happened. We can't know that, but certainly by the summer of 2022, there were numerous risks of genocide that ought to have been identified by states and considered by all of them in conjunction with the development of plans to comply with their own legal obligation to prevent genocide. Not only were states privy to the Russian Federation's genocidal rhetoric, and we talked about that at some length in the first session, but there were mounting atrocities that were being committed and reported upon widely in the media and through reports issued by organizations such as NGOs and other bodies such as the United Nations. These atrocities warranted a comprehensive analysis of the risk of genocide, even at that time. For example, in an initial report in 2022, the New Lines Institute found reasonable grounds to believe that Russia had engaged in direct and public incitement to commit genocide and determined there was a serious risk of genocide, basing its conclusions on open source evidence. That's already in 2022. In a follow-up report the following year, in July of 2023, the Institute outlined increasing evidence that Russia's attempts to commit and incite genocide against Ukrainians had intensified, while its coordinated and systematic campaign to do so had evolved with new tactics targeting an increasingly wide number of Ukrainians far from the battlefield. The UN also provided guidance. When states are assessing the risk of genocide, they should look to guidance from the United Nations as it plays an important role, whether through resolutions of the Security Council or the General Assembly, or through the creation of reports created by specific UN bodies. For example, in March of 2022, the UN Human Rights Council passed a resolution establishing the Independent International Commission of Inquiry to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights, violations of international humanitarian law, and related crimes in the context of the aggression against Ukraine by the Russian Federation. And the Independent Commission has produced several reports since it was created. In a report presented to the UN Human Rights Council in March of 2023, that Independent International Commission described its findings relating to the transfer or deportation of children. So this is more than 2 years ago now, and provided its views that some of the actions described may amount to war crimes. And we certainly have now seen the ICC issue arrest warrants against both Putin and the Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Belova. Sorry, I think I got that right. The Commission also expressed its concern about allegations of genocide. However, it indicated that it had not yet reached a conclusion on whether there was genocide in Ukraine based on available evidence to that date. Though it did note that some of the rhetoric allegedly transmitted in Russian state and other media may constitute direct and public incitement to commit genocide. Genocide Watch considers situations as they develop and declares a genocide emergency when the genocidal process has, in their view, reached the stage of genocidal massacres and other acts of genocide. Well, in 2024, Genocide Watch published its recommendations and listed Ukraine in the emergencies category. Looking back, states should be able to articulate what assessments, if any, were undertaken to assess the risk of genocide in Ukraine as the situation was unfolding and changing, and explain the basis for any assessment results. States should also be able to outline what specific actions, if any, were taken in direct response to these assessments for the purpose of preventing genocide in accordance with the due diligence requirement set out by the ICJ and states' obligations to take all measures within its power. Next slide, please. Each state must consider its capacity to influence and determine how best to utilize that capacity in ways that are appropriately responsive to its legal obligations. When states consider capacity to influence, assessments should include how a state might be able to influence both through its own actions, but also through collective state action with other states. Some say that the minimum duty owed by states, some scholars, is to name and shame the situation as genocide. Some have said that it is the necessary starting point for criminal investigations in this direction. In March of 2024, the USA House of Representatives, i.e. Congress, passed a resolution specifically declaring, and I quote, that the abduction and forcible transfer of children and facilitation of illegal adoptions is contrary to Russia's obligations under the Genocide Convention and amounts to genocide, close quote. The resolution further declared, and I quote, that the Russian Federation is attempting to wipe out a generation of Ukrainian children, thereby crippling Ukraine's ability to nurture the next generation of Ukrainian citizens and leaders, and to rebuild their country after Russia's unprovoked war, with the purpose of demolishing Ukraine's unique language, culture, history, and identity, close quote. That resolution was described as signaling a major bipartisan USA policy shift in labeling and shaming Russian perpetrators of genocide. And although it was non-binding, the official condemnation from a supermajority of representatives affirmed that Russia's abduction, in the view of the United States, Russia's transfer and forcible adoption of Ukrainian children is, quote, contrary to Russia's obligations under the Genocide Convention and amounts to genocide, close quote. States that have not already characterized the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children as genocide should assess what is happening and then take steps, I submit, to appropriately describe the situation. It could be that perhaps states are reluctant to do that naming and shaming because maybe they're concerned that in doing so, they will somehow attract liability and have to do something. It may result in the assumption of legal obligations. However, as we've been discussing, the obligation to prevent genocide exists, whether or not a state publicly comments on a situation as being genocidal. Many states have implemented sanctions in various degrees to pressure the Russian Federation to cease its war of aggression against Ukraine, a war that has enabled the abduction of children. One scholar, noting the ICJ's reference to a state's power to contribute to restraining in any degree the commission of genocide, determined that this wording seemed to imply that the capacity to influence can certainly be construed very broadly. Therefore, when considering what could be done to influence conduct, states, I submit, should think very broadly in terms of identifying actions that could restrain in any degree the commission or continuation of genocide, and actually then take all measures within their power to comply with their essential duty to prevent genocide. Next slide, please. Being in a position to influence correlates, of course, to power that can also be exercised through actions taken, but also actions that aren't taken, or insufficient actions, or withdrawal of actions. So as important as it is to determine what actions correlate with the duty to prevent genocide, states should also ascertain and refrain from any actions that may not align with that duty. For example, if a state imposes some sanctions but chooses to maintain important economic ties with an aggressor state, could it reasonably assert that it has taken all measures to prevent genocide in accordance with the due diligence standard established by the ICJ? Or might the state be viewed as having taken only half measures? Similarly, how might a state's withdrawal of assistance be viewed? Withdrawal of assistance. For example, if a genocide is ongoing or the risk of genocide remains, states may wish to assess whether withdrawal of support may reflect non-compliance with its duty to prevent genocide, having regard to its capacity to influence. As noted, the USA previously passed a congressional resolution that characterized the forcible transfer of children, Ukrainian children, as genocide. However, the current administration then decided to withdraw funding for a project undertaken by the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab in collaboration with the government to research the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children and preserve evidence of what amounts to war crimes. In other words, the decision to cease funding that project does not appear, arguably, to align with the United States' duty to prevent genocide, especially in circumstances where the government has explicitly recognized the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children as conduct amounting to genocide. With its tremendous influence as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and its position on the geopolitical stage, it transmits, at the very least, an odd or confusing message to other states. Other states, including other permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, may also have greater opportunities and responsibilities to influence Putin and potentially assist in bringing about an end to Russia's war of aggression. Arguably, for example, China wields tremendous influence and could do much, using its relationship with Putin and its powerful economy to effect positive change and help bring about opportunities for peace. And while we will never know, likely, what might be being said behind closed doors, we do know that in a meeting in June of 2025 relating to a United Nations Security Council emergency briefing on Ukraine, the USA representative urged all countries, including China, to stop exports to Russia of dual-use goods that contribute to Russia's war, industrial base, and enable its drone and missile attacks against Ukraine. It's certainly reasonable to argue that this kind of conduct undertaken by China does not align with its own state responsibility to prevent genocide. To briefly summarize today's discussion, while the Bosnian genocide case provided some guidance for states in terms of detailing what the duty to prevent genocide entails, it did not and could not provide an actual roadmap or a detailed guidebook setting out item and verse the lists of concrete actions that states might take to demonstrate compliance with their duty to prevent genocide. Because, of course, much depends on the circumstances that raise concerns about the risk of genocide in any given situation, as well as the capacity of individual states to influence, either on their own or collectively, and, of course, the ever-changing geopolitical dynamics that we see happening in the world, especially today. However, the duty to prevent genocide is real. Its breach may, and as we can see, has resulted in horrific atrocities. And the due diligence requirement articulated by the ICJ in the Bosnian genocide case provides sufficient direction to states to enable compliance with that essential duty. And I'm open to questions.
Thank you very much, Darcia. What a detailed presentation, I would say, as expected from a practicing lawyer. I mean, now retired, but very much well into the topic. The audience, we have been listening quite intently. Uh, I would say attentively, rather, the details of the due diligence aspect. We don't have a lot of time for the Q&A session today. Nonetheless, I would like to ask Darcia a kind of little practical question. So, Darcia, in your view, what specific measures should Canada and other democratic states prioritize to ensure that they are meeting their duty to prevent genocide in Ukraine? Are you happy with Canada's measures taken so far?
Well, that's a complicated question because I'm very pleased to note that Canada is taking a lead with respect to a task force of states, if you will, to work on the repatriation of these children, to bring more awareness to it, to advocate for them, and on the world stage. And in fact, it's my understanding that at a side event this very week at the United Nations General Assembly meetings, our own Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is going to be hosting a session with Ukraine's President Zelensky, specifically to talk about the issues relating to the forcible transfer of Ukrainian children. And that is very admirable. However, I have not seen literature coming out from Canada, for example, describing the forcible transfer of children, or indeed what is happening generally in Ukraine as genocide. I heard the argument from not from a Canadian scholar, but from an individual who's well known in the area, who said, well, of course they're committing a crime of aggression, but I don't think it's genocide. And at a webinar, I specifically asked in the Q&A, well, why not? What are you looking at? How are you assessing whether genocide is occurring? And I think there's been a lot of discomfort of late with people using the word genocide. There has been criticisms that the word is being used too often these days, when it should be reserved for only the most serious crimes. And in response to that, I would say it's unfortunate that in this day and age, we're in times where not only is it appropriate to consider whether there is the risk of genocide or if it's already happening, that there are arguably a number of genocides going on around the world, as you know, being a genocide scholar yourself, whether we're talking about the Rohingya and in Myanmar and South Sudan. And again, there's not a lot of attention being given to that on any given day. And people, frankly, have war fatigue. They don't want to hear about bad news. But I argue that governments and states have these incredibly important responsibilities. There isn't really an option to get tired of bad news, and these obligations should be complied with. And I think in addition to naming and shaming, there are other things that could be done. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, because I hope that in tomorrow's webinar, we can discuss how the duty to prevent genocide really should impact negotiations for a just peace for Ukraine. I noted with a lot of discomfort and concern that for example, last proposition on the table from the US back in March or April, its last proposed peace plan, did not even mention anything about the children. And there was much talk about giving up territory, moving borders, and this kind of thing. Again, all in breach of international law, which begs the question, if somebody were to even have followed that, how binding would that be? If Ukraine could argue that it's under pressure to accept that kind of a peace deal. But there was no discussion of the children. And I argue, and I have argued in my thesis that that's led to these webinars, that the ongoing lack of repatriation of these children is really an ongoing genocide, and that it will continue to occur, even if there's a ceasefire tomorrow. Until those children are returned, there is still genocide, because remember, genocide can happen in times of war or in times of peace. So even if there's a peace declared tomorrow, what happens to these children? They aren't returned. So in tomorrow's webinar, I hope to discuss at some length why this essential duty to prevent genocide should be front and center relating to the return of these children in order to help secure what would be a true, just, and arguably lasting peace for Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Darcia. The audience, I would like to also share with you a group based in United Kingdom. Darcia is very much aware of International Bar Association, and in the past we we were in touch with them. But here is the screen that I'm going to share with you. And if you're interested, it is very interesting project. It's called Eyewitness to Atrocities, and this is very extraordinary effort to document the ongoing genocide. And remember, the audience, what Darcia was referring to in response to my question, that genocide possibly is a classic case, Ukraine, because even after a peace process, peace treaty, ceasefire occurred, genocide possibly would continue because children were never returned. And this is something very classic in a sense because of this project led by a group of very, I would say, experts and very knowledgeable persons. And if you're interested, please visit International Bar Association and their wonderful project, which is very relevant to our discussion today. So, having said so, Darcia, just say a few words in order to conclude today's session, leading up to tomorrow's final session.
Thank you, Kaiser. I just want to stress that I don't believe that there's been nearly enough attention paid to the duty to prevent genocide. And in connection with that, I believe that states have fallen far short of what is actually required of them in terms of conducting the risk assessments that are required in order for them to even determine properly whether there is a risk of genocide at any given moment or one that's already started. And then to take that analysis and determine, okay, now what are we going to do to comply with that essential obligation to prevent it or to stop it from continuing if it's already started? And why is that? I think there's been some confusion. I'm doing some conjecture here, but that people seem to think that you have to wait until the ICJ or some other court, the ICC, has found somebody guilty of genocide before you do anything. And that is absolutely not correct in my view. You don't wait. The court was clear in the ICJ decision that the duty is triggered when a state becomes aware of or should have become aware of. So you can't be what we'd call in law a term of willfully blind, for example, although that term wasn't used in the case as I recall. But you can't close your eyes to it and just because you decide not to look, be absolved of your international legal obligations to act in accordance with the Genocide Convention and even with customary international law obligations.
Thank you. Thank you, Darcia, again for your concluding remarks. Thank you to all our audience and especially Darcia, who presented today, for engaging in this important conversation. Over the course of today's session, we have explored the meaning of the duty to prevent genocide, what due diligence requires of states, and how these standards can be applied in the context of ongoing war in Ukraine. We have heard that prevention is not only a legal duty, but also a moral and political responsibility, one that calls for vigilance, courage, and action. And you don't have to wait for ICJ to conclude, in years that it was a genocide. It is incumbent on everyone, states, civil society, and others to intervene to prevent genocide. The audience, what emerges clearly from today's discussion is that compliance with the duty to prevent genocide is not measured only by rhetorics, but by concrete steps: early warning, consistent monitoring, humanitarian support, diplomatic engagement, so on and so forth. These are not abstract obligations, they are practical measures that can make the difference between wars and lives saved. As part of the Peace Days initiative, dear audience, our goal is not only to deepen our understanding of international law, such as this session, but also to inspire a culture of prevention, a culture where governments, institutions, and civil society see atrocity prevention as a shared responsibility. On behalf of the Institute, I thank you once again for your time, your insights, and your commitment to justice and peace. And do not forget that our session is part of Peace Days 2025. Please visit www.peacedays.ca for detailed events that are happening in our beautiful city of Winnipeg. On behalf of the Institute, once again, Darcia, thank you very much for being with us and sharing your insights. And folks, do tune to our last episode tomorrow. Will be aired in the same time. And tomorrow, Darcia is going to speak on a very interesting topic and summarizing this three-part episode that she planned out of her recent degree of LLM. And I think it's worth sharing. Take care, and till then, stay well and stay fine. Bye bye.
And thank you. Bye bye.